Shafter. Let it be known that all members of the council are present with the exception of Councilman Alvarado, who has an excused absence working late tonight. Looking for an approval of agenda.
I move approved.
Motion by Mayor Pro Tem Prout, looking for a second.
I'll second.
Second by Councilman Espinoza. Roll call vote, please.
Mayor Pro Tem Prout,
Yes.
Olvera,
Yes.
Espinoza,
Yes.
and Gibbon.
Yes. Is there any public comment time? We'll open the session up for public comment for any of those who wish to speak on behalf of the agenda or another topic. Okay. Seeing none here and none online, we will close the public comment time and move into management report with our city manager Gabriel for fiscal year 2023-2024 operating revenues projections and proposed expenses. This is our workshop number 1.
So, Mayor and Council, this is the first workshop to kick off our budget process for fiscal year 23-24. If you can believe it, it's already that time of year again. This afternoon, our finance director, Roger Sanchez, will provide you a high-level overview of our revenue projections as well as on the expenses. This is not all the department budgets in detail. Okay, though those will follow in the coming workshops. Rather, this is always the beginning of the beginning of the budget information will provide to you how we will structure our budget based on our revenues and our larger expenses like the salary and benefits and some of the line items that we see where inflation has really kicked up those operational costs related to like utilities, fuel, just to give you some examples. So without any further ado, I'll refer to Roger. So go ahead, Roger, take it away.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor, council members. Roger Sanchez, Finance Director for the City of Shafter. So as the city manager has indicated, I'll give you an overview. This is a high-level overview, but behind the scenes, it has all the details that we need for labor cost and M&O expenses, all the operating expenses. I also like to give you a heads up coming up on the next council meeting related to the workshop, the second workshop. It'll be focused on the capital improvement program, the CIP. It is going to have drastic differences compared to past years. So we're going to have a 5-year plan, whereas in the past that hasn't been the case that I'm aware of. So that'll be a big change. So on the overview, we like to provide with the citywide operating expenses and revenues. We'll also have an overview of the general fund operating revenues and expenses and the enterprise operating revenues and expenses. So starting out with this is citywide operating revenues by account type. And this includes internal transfers and internal charges and grants so that we can have a good view of what's coming. So we'll start with the taxes. You can see the history on taxes and the proposed for the 23-24 year. Now notice there's a lot of information, even though it's simplified. If you see on the taxes at the beginning of the year in 17-18, if you compare that to the most current year, which is 21-22 actual, there's a variance, there's an increase of $11 million, a significant increase on those revenues. So that's wonderful, wonderful news for Shafter there. After that, we do have charges for services, connection fees, licenses and permits, others, and for a total operating revenues that you can see. Again, this the 5-year changes from fiscal year 18 compared to the 22, those 5 years, it represents a growth rate, compound growth rate of 8.7%, or a combined change of $16.8 million increase if you compare over a 5-year period.
Hey, Roger, so I see a $600,000 difference between our projected and our proposed. And I'm looking at it on the connection fees, there's a $1.3 million difference where it's a drop down. Is that an indication to not having as much business growth or housing growth? What would lead to that piece of it?
So this is because it's a projection, and because we're in the midst of a recession, there's, rumblings with things, and how would that look? We did get information as much as we could from building department, from public works. But there's also a sense of caution on the building side.
Okay.
And now on the sales taxes, there's no change. Those are the numbers that we got from the consultants. Surprisingly, there's very little change on that. So they remained optimistic.
So we're just being conservative then when it comes to that.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Very
A little
good.
bit
Thank you.
conservative.
And just to add to that, Mayor, it's in consultation with our largest builder, Lennar, in terms of what they're experiencing with the housing market related to the higher interest rates. So they too have seen an slowdown in the sale of their home. So we're adjusting for that. And then also too, as you're aware, some of the planned tract subdivisions within the core city have slowed down. Some of them started, and for various reasons, they're not ready to build or will scale back, whether it's to the market, interest rates, or whatever the case may be. So we're just taking a more conservative approach in that regard. So you're correct. We're taking a conservative approach.
So this information is by account type, as I mentioned. The next slide is the same information, except that it has a comparison of budget to budget. That is the current year budget against the proposed budget next year. So it records a change as well in dollars and a change in a percentage. So you see the taxes with a 1.45 million increase that we're projecting, which represents 4.5%. The biggest thing is the connection fees on that end, which is represented 25% increase. And also you can see the licenses and permits at 4.9% change. Again, this is budget. It's not comparing the historical actuals. This other chart is the same as before, the previous chart, but this is broken by fund group. So you can see the general fund versus the enterprise funds, special revenues, connections and impact fees. And then you can see the same dollars as the previous chart. So this summary is the change between the two budgets. Again, the difference is based on by fund group. And you can see the enterprise funds. There's a modest decrease on the enterprise funds, and unless there's some changes on rate fees. Part of the reason has to do with collections issues that we've been dealing with. Now with the water shutoffs, there's some improvements, but we still, there's some assistance related to the water and the sewer, but on the refuse side, there's no assistance. And so we have to deal with those things as well. This is a historical citywide labor cost. So you can see from the year 18 compared to 22 and 23. There's the wages, the benefits, and the total labor cost. The one on the first year, which is 17-18, that has a payout related to the PERS, to the pension cost. And so there was a prepayment back in that year. So that's why it's kind of it looks a little strange. But you can see the trend there.
Just if I may, that prepayment on the PERS, that's when we pay down our unfunded PERS liability. So currently the city has a zero unfunded liability, unlike other cities that carry a pretty significant unfunded liability with PERS. The unfunded liability is basically the amount of money the city needs to have available with PERS to be able to pay for all of the pension retirement, basically, for our current, past employees and future employees. And so for the city to have a zero unfunded liability with PERS, it's pretty significant from a financial stance and in our credit rating, because that's basically debt on the books that now under GASB rules, we have to account for that money on our financials. So it'd be like you in our personal lives, whatever we're trying to set aside for our retirement shows up as a liability. And so we are fully funded in regards to being able to pay for our employees' retirements, as I said, current, past, and future employees.
Well, and it was really fortunate that we had that $6 million to be able to
Exactly.
do that. Jump in there.
Excuse me.
This is historical maintenance and operations cost. This is citywide. And this has about a 6% compound annual growth rate, or a change of about $2 million between the fiscal year 18, as you can see, into the 22 most recent year. This is historical electric cost. The first on the bottom represents the water power cost, and then the other funds for a total electric cost. So you can see there's a history. As I mentioned before, there's a significant higher increases on the other funds compared to the water fund. The growth rate on the water fund is around 6.2% versus the other funds at 15% growth rate.
Interesting chart. I don't think I've seen that one before. Is there a way to, this sounds really bad. Is there a way to tell, back at the electrical cost, is there a way to tell the difference from with solar and without solar? What it should cost? I mean, that's a hard number to run, I would imagine.
So this, in a way, in some regards, there's some solar on the water fund,
Right.
which is half of the cost or growth rate, of the growth rate compared to the other ones where there's no solar. So on the non-solar, there's a 15% increase or growth rate for those costs. So it does give some glimpse that there's some benefit on the solar. We don't have the full details on those.
It could potentially be somewhere around $150,000 to $220,000, give or take. I mean, you're talking 6 or 7%.
Yes, yeah.
Just
Just
to
interesting.
add to that, Mayor, we should have, because what the consultants will do is gather all the data of our current usage before we install solar, because that's what they base the projections in terms of the cost savings and how we plan to use that cost savings to pay back for the infrastructure. So what we have right now with our current structure is a PPA, power purchase agreement. So it's not a traditional solar project like you might do at your house where the electrical power is going back into. We're actually buying from this vendor. But we should have numbers on those calculations that were done prior to us installing the solar.
How much does that change with PG&E's new update rolling out this year? I think it's NEMA 3. NEMA 3?
So long as we applied, and we did apply to lock in future sites, we would still qualify under the old rate.
Oh, okay.
Moving forward, I believe we had till April 15th to submit our applications to PG&E. If we fail to submit our applications or elected not to, then any future solar projects that the city undertook would fall under the new rate. and we wouldn't get the same structures we currently get now.
We're probably what, 16 or 18 cents per kilowatt?
I couldn't tell you top of my head on that.
I've seen numbers as far as tripling that with PG&E's new program.
Right,
So
it's not going to be as generous, for lack of a better term. Not that PG&E is ever generous, but in terms of the solar program.
they have no way to store the power. And
Right.
so now they're pushing it back on everybody else saying, well,
Exactly.
we don't want to store power for you. So I just found it a really interesting chart. Sorry.
And the storage capacity, still the technology is not as well developed.
Correct.
And so it's very expensive. And we're also competing with electric cars because it's basically the same battery pack that is used in electric cars like Tesla and Bolt and some of those other cars. We're competing with that industry as well. So
Thank you.
We continue with citywide historical operating expenses. On the first section, we can see the labor cost. Now, if we combine the maintenance and operations for a total operating cost. So on the citywide labor cost, it has a growth rate, a 4-year growth rate of 5.8% versus the maintenance and operations at 6%. This is the change budget to budget on wages, benefits, total labor cost. If we compare budget to budget, it's a $1.67 million increase, or 11.3% on the labor side. On the M&O is slightly less when we compare budget to budget at a 3.9% increase. So there's on the bottom is the total operating expenses variance.
Where are we tracking right now and projected? Like current state, not proposed, but projected. Do you know where we're tracking?
Yeah, so the projected is the last year where you see the 22-23, that's a projected total, which is 27.3 million.
So about almost $300,000 more than we budgeted.
So if we look at the projected at 27.3 million, and then we look at the budget of the current year is 27.03, so it's pretty close to budget. For next year, that's where the big difference comes.
But what is it? What is that 3%? What is that 3%?
What is that 3%?
Yeah, why did it go up so much?
The 3.9%?
Mhm.
Some of it is related to fuel cost. Also, there's training cost that there's some changes on training as well. If you recall in the during COVID, there was limited training in the past years. So there's some changes on that, and we'll provide some details on those as well.
yeah, Member Demmer and Council. This is citywide. So this is not just the general fund, but this is citywide. So this also includes our enterprise funds that our utility manager, Marcos, had during the budget review advises that this is another example. The cost of goods have gone up. Inflation has not been solely restricted to just fuel or utilities or certain areas. It's basically every product we get, every service we get, everything we purchase has gone up. And one of the impacts that we've seen this is in the chemicals for our water treatment at the wells. We've experienced a pretty significant increase in the chemicals that we purchase. And the chemicals is not something we just buy periodically. This is ongoing because we do all our water treatment at the wells. And so whether it's replacing the medium, the chemicals that we buy, the chlorine, all of that to clean purifier water at the wells. That's an example of where the cost, significant cost has happened. So, and then utilities, fleet has gone up, fuel, parts for everything else. It's just the cost of doing business where we've seen a pretty significant increase. Like I said, we're not immune to anything else that's going on in the economy. Everything impacts us as well.
Well, and with this year and possible recession, those will even go higher than what we projected.
Yeah, there's always
Doesn't
that
look very
variable
good.
that the
Mhm.
cost for goods are going to go up. Right.
Right.
And then, you know, we did experience, you know, everyone talks about the whole supply chain, but if we experience another episode like that, I mean, that's also too likely to
Mhm.
impact us as well. So,
Sure.
I just complained about my groceries.
That's just one thing.
Yeah, that's just one thing.
Yeah, but look at everything goes to it.
Absolutely.
We're putting a lot of effort with Public Works to keep track of the cost. So now we keep track of testing water and chemicals,
Mhm.
whereas before it would go into one bucket. So we're separating all those costs so we better understand them in the future and we have a better analysis in the future as well. So those things are new.
Well, but even when you see the trend on the chart, I mean, you see how it did. I mean, it continued to go up 7 to 8 to 9, yeah, and then all the way up to 12. So, yeah, okay.
So we have a slightly more focus on the general fund at this time. This is related to revenues. So we have the taxes. We expect an increase. Charges for services, licenses. We have the fines, rents, and investments. So for a total of operating general fund operating revenues. So there's a slight decrease, and not on the taxes, but rather on the building section. There's a change on revenues related to the general fund. And again, this is budget to budget. We do expect an increase of $1.9 million or 5.7%.
How does that compare to previous years?
On the revenues.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the chart for previous years on the revenues related to the general fund.
Because even the sales tax hasn't kept up with everything. Is that right? That's the way I see it.
The sales tax it has had high growth rates in retail due to few retail companies, but also the online sales taxes. And I can provide a detailed breakdown of sales taxes, but there's been growth on the online sales and also the retail. It has surpassed, I believe it's over 8% growth rate on taxes.
Just, Mayor Pro Tem, your comment was referring to the fact that due to inflation and cost of services and goods that we purchase, if you look at it from the percentage change of the increases we're seeing to the revenue increases, you would be correct. Our revenues are not keeping up with the cost of inflation, the cost of goods as those are going up. So there is a bit of a slight difference in the growth percentage between each of those.
So even if, you know, publicly, I guess I could say it, even though we might say that there's going to be a recession that will really hit us hard before the end of this year, as that changes back, as it comes back down, will we see it a big jump? I mean, does that happen?
If I understand your question, if we do see a severe recession, by historical standards, we would tend to see high unemployment, cost of goods should go down, things would go a little bit cheaper in the future. if things go really bad. At the same time, we would expect less revenues from taxes and things and less collections.
But how long, I guess what I'm looking at is, would we see that difference happen by the start of 24?
With the cost
Yeah.
decreases,
Yes, then will it come back around?
well, that would be hard to tell, but the federal government has a big problem where
Yeah.
they're trying to control inflation, and they keep
Raising rate interest.
raising the rates, which is creating now estimated over $1 trillion in unrealized losses related to investment. So it's kind of a unique problem compared to previous recessions. So it would be hard to tell on the cost.
So history doesn't really tell you enough, huh?
No,
That's why I was asking.
if I would put my money, I would say that the cost will continue for next year. High cost on regular operating expenses.
Or we say and next year it would be the 24 year then. Okay, that's what, yeah, okay.
If I may make a comment, so our revenues lag, the economy is measured in quarters, right? So the federal government issues their GDP, their unemployment, all the economic factors, consumer price index, all of that is done on a quarterly basis. So Q1, 2, 3, and 4. For our purposes with sales tax, for example, if we were to hit a recession in Q4, right? At this point, we're looking at the next 2 quarters because we're in April, so we would have to be hitting a recession July, August, September,
Mhm.
and then October, November, December, right? So because it has to be 2 consecutive quarters that GDP goes down, right? So what that means that the recession, technically, that would be the period in which we're in a recession. So that means that unemployment would go up, consumer price index would go down, because the higher it gets to 100%, that basically means that the consumer confidence index means how comfortable, how confident the consumer feels in today's economy to make purchases. Right. So they're making large purchases, appliances, vehicles, that sort of thing. The lower the CPI is 100, that means that the confidence in the consumer is that they're saving more money and spending less and not deferring those larger purchases, right? So for us as a city that we rely on sales tax, we would lag when we got hit with that. Correct. Because the state franchise tax board is usually behind anywhere between 2 to 3 months, up to 6 months at a time. From the time that a business pays their sales tax to the state, we don't get it till 3 to 6 months after the fact. So any loss of revenue, we wouldn't feel till probably like Q2 of 2024, and then after that. So the biggest impact to us from a revenue stance, we would feel most likely late Q2 of 2024 or even Q3 of 2024 is when we would really feel that impact, because our revenues lag in terms of when it's paid at the sales tax. And then the fact that the federal government has to declare a recession based on 2 consecutive quarters of GDP going down, right? So typically we won't feel the impact right away. That's why when the Great Recession of 2008 hit, the reverse happened when businesses started recovering and the consumer price index started going up. We didn't realize that new revenue coming back because it was lagging in terms of how we received our revenues.
This is the general fund operating expenses. Once you combine the labor and the M&O, and the projected for at the end of this fiscal year is 15.7 million. The actual on the most recent year is in fiscal year 21-22 is at $15.1 million. And this is the change between within the general fund between 2 budgets. with a total operating expenses increase of 5.3%. The M&O, it's staying within, year over year for the general fund. This is the water historical operating revenues versus expenses. We see the labor cost within the water fund, the M&O, and this is the revenue. So this doesn't mean that we have revenues much higher than expenses. This does not include internal charges, and it does not include depreciation expense as well. Overall, it's pretty tight on the enterprise funds. When we cover the operating expenses, especially during inflation, once we close the years in the next few weeks, and I bring a better analysis of the water fund, we'll provide depreciation expense and other internal charges, so you'll have a better view. But because we're focused on labor cost and the maintenance and operations, you can have a sense of what the revenues look like operating versus the operating expenses and what the trend is. There's the total at 3.6 projected for 22-23 year. Again, this is for the water fund. On the wastewater, similar. We don't show the internal charges and we don't show the depreciation expense, but you can have a sense of the operating costs compared to the operating revenues. On the refuse, we have the labor cost, the M&O, and the revenues, and then the total expenses. So on the 22-23, there's still a projected, we're still refining our numbers, but keep in mind that we switch from internal operations into outsourcing the activity. So we're still learning from that information as well. One interesting thing is we're not including the franchise fees on this revenue. So that's something that we can include for analysis purposes. This only includes the fees for customers. So, but there's an increase nonetheless on the outsourcing for the refuse. So that's what we have. If you have any other questions.
I have some questions. I need clarification. So we've got let me go find all this again. We've got a citywide historical operating expenses. I don't know what slide that is for you, 17 of 27. I think you're too far.
Citywide, right?
Citywide historical operating expenses. Okay, so that 27.3 on the projected, the very last one. That is, when we talk citywide, that includes enterprises, yes?
Yes.
Okay. So that's what I thought as well when I was trying to run that comparison. But then if I go over here to general fund labor cost, and I add in the 12.8 million on the general fund labor cost, plus the 15.7 million in the general fund operating costs, this is only general fund, we end up with 28.5 million, more than adding the enterprises. So I'm missing something somewhere.
So general fund, can you repeat that? General fund on?
So go to, I don't know who's got the controls.
Here.
Go go to slide 21 and 22, please.
Can you hit escape?
Because I was sitting here trying to math some numbers here, and there are things that are just not
Can you share?
clicking in my head very well. I apologize.
Yeah, this side, can you share it on that?
Twenty-one and 22 respectively, please.
You're talking about labor costs, so.
Yeah, well, I'm talking about both. So that one, and then I don't know if you have them double-sided printed, Miss Brown. I apologize. 21 and 22. So I take the 15.7. This is only general fund. So that's general fund labor costs. And in on the projected for 22-23, it's $12.8 million. Now I go to the next slide, and this is only general fund, correct?
Yes.
So my next slide for general fund only operating cost is 12.8. I'm sorry, 15.7. Keep one more. There you go. So if I take my 15.7 plus my 12.8, that should be my general fund operating expenses. Is that correct?
No, this is, if you go back more. So this is labor cost 12.8, right?
And then the next slide is
12.8.
correct.
So this is labor. So on the next slide,
Operating expenses.
it combines on the bottom, the 12.8 plus 2.9 for a total of 15.7.
Okay, I see what you did. So you added those two, so it's more or less seeing two slides together. Okay,
Yeah.
so 15.7.
So that's general fund, 15.7 is
Thank
general
you.
fund.
Yeah, I was getting really confused on where those numbers were coming from. So
Okay,
I needed some clarification on that. Thank you.
so the bottom section is the labor, whereas the M and O is 2.9 million.
So it's 15.7. Thank you. Because I was having a really hard time seeing that. Thank you for clarifying that for me. There it is. So that's 43.4%. What is our policy is 55% or 60%?
Oh.
Operating revenues.
Reserve,
Yes.
Roger, you recall top of your head?
I have to search for that, but the reserves are much higher.
Correct.
Yeah, than,
But
Yeah.
on a year-to-year basis, there's still a policy level where we shouldn't be touching over X amount of whatever that percentage is. It should be a year-over-year basis, right? Not so much just the reserves in general, but also a year-over-year. Am I
It's a
wrong?
percentage of the total operating budget.
Yeah, correct.
So our operating budget, say to last year was 30 million, just throwing numbers.
Yeah, correct.
Was,
And
was what?
I'm
He's just
throwing
throwing
numbers
numbers.
out there,
Oh,
right?
okay.
And it's our total budget is 30 million, general fund. Then this year, our projected year, next year is 32, right? So if it's 50% of our operating budget, that means we would do 15 for last year, but if we're now 32, then we would be at 16.
Yeah. Okay. I just don't remember if it was 50, 55, or 60.
Yeah, it's not based on dollar amount, it's a total operating budget percentage of.
Yeah, correct. Okay. Thank you again for answering. I know I can look that up in the charter. I just do not remember on the top of my head.
I don't know that it's in the charter.
I thought we had that percentage in the charter.
No, I
No.
think it's probably a separate policy. Our charter
Yeah, it was just,
doesn't specify specific.
because you can
percent.
never really have enough in reserve when you think about it.
No, I agree. You can't have enough in reserve, but I know from a policy, see, again, I thought it was charter. I thought from a policy, a year over year, there was a, not to exceed X amount of the percentage of spend. So Okay.
Yeah, I can email you a section of the policy. The way I understand it is it compares the operating expenses for
Mhm.
the full year against the reserve. So as long as the reserve has sufficient to cover a full year or whatever the policy says, then it meets that requirement. But I can provide that paragraph on an email if you like.
If you don't mind, just for my
I don't know if
clarity's
it's a
sake.
risk even then to compare it to say that you have enough for another year of expenses. Because expenses could be so much higher. You can never have enough.
Yeah, see, I like comparing it year to year, not year to, oh my gosh, reserves, right? It's nice to see what it looks like on a year over year basis. What are our expenses versus our income? And then make the determination based on those projections. You know, are we within my mind's running to is, are we within that policy, right?
Mhm.
Not really looking at reserves, because reserves should be left for, you know, I don't want to say catastrophic events, but things like, you know, paying down PERS. You know, that's you're using it for something that's only going to bring a financial benefit for the future, right? You're growing on that. So I think that's what makes sense. I'm more intrigued on what is our policy on operating expenses versus operating revenue on a year over year basis. Fair?
Yes, so one of the things that I keep an eye on every year is can the operating revenues cover the operating expenses? Because any leftover means you can use it for either to build the reserves or for capital projects or CIP. So we have to be careful. Can we cover the ongoing revenues? Can we cover the operating expenses? And that's part of the annual financial report as we close the books as well. That has that analysis and also the reserves analysis. But yeah, we keep an eye on that.
Because you're at, if those numbers are correct, you're at 43.4% on the 2022-23 projected. I don't know this year, but the general fund, you're at 43.4% of usage, meaning your general fund is total operating revenues of 36.1 million. You've got 15.7 million in total expenses. So you're using 43.4% of your total revenue for general fund. Obviously, the enterprise funds are at that net zero. They're obviously we have an issue with the trash, but I agree we can look at those numbers. Regardless, those should be coming in at net zero. What we make, we spend, and that makes sense. So really, when it's all said and done, you're looking at general fund. You know, are we touching that? Are we getting close to that? Or are we not getting close to that? So 43.4%, again, based on your numbers, that was a 2022-23 projection. So it seems good.
Yeah, you know, the gap between operating revenues and expenses is meaning expenses are going higher. The revenue is also going high, but it's getting narrower and narrower year over year. That is true.
Yes.
And that's something to be mindful of.
Yeah, and you can, you know, just looking at some of your charts, they're really good, by the way, because you can start to see exactly when that inflation issue started to rise up. And it wasn't, for the most part, everything was really just following a certain percentage. I mean, if I'm looking at just basic general fund operations, you were within a few percentage points of each other. And then the very moment that you see that inflation situation rise up, you can just see everything started to shift and change really quickly.
Yeah.
Questions, comments, council? Now's the time to ask if you have good questions.
Roger, I don't pretend to be a numbers guy, but in what you're seeing, and what the numbers are telling you, I don't see in my looking at this, I don't see any real major spikes or anything. Everything kind of seems to be on a gradual curve, or if that's the right term to use. Is that the way you see it too?
Well, I would say so, and the only reason is because the growth of revenues has been much higher than inflation historically. It's been over 8%. So historically, we had like 2% inflation. So all these years, we've been enjoying this growth of sales taxes, permits, licenses,
Mhm.
all those things have been there. Had it not been for that, that's not what I would see. I would see constant cost increases. So thank goodness for those revenues have been above those inflation in the past. So as of now, that growth of revenues is more in alignment with the current inflation, which is ridiculously high at this point.
Right, right. So that gap is narrowing down right now.
Yes,
Okay.
yeah, we're gonna see it narrow down as we move forward in the upcoming couple of years or 3 years. Yeah.
Thank you.
Unless there's more businesses, of course.
Any other questions, comments, or concerns?
Yeah, if nothing else from council. That concludes our presentation. And like I said, Roger gave you a preview at the next workshop on the 18th. And so we'll continue to go through the process.
We hope you'll like the CAP is gonna be different. It's gonna be a lot of information on the capital improvement plan.
Okay, very good. Well, with that being said, no other questions or comments. I'm going to ask for a motion for dismissal for the evening and be back here at 6 o'clock. Need a
Make a
motion?
motion to dismiss, and thank you very much, Ron.
Very good. I have a motion by Council Member Espinoza, second by Council Member Olvera. All those in favor with aye?
Aye.
Same sign for oppose. Hearing none. We are dismissed. It's 4.